And they do have a policy of harmonization of the asylum laws and procedures. There's way too much to talk about, but I wanted to talk about a couple of notions in that regard. In terms of harmonization, the Afghans in Greece, Afghan claims in Greece, their acceptance rate is 0.04%, 6 out of 1,556. Whereas there are many that have had, in terms of the Afghans, their acceptance rates are around 50%. In terms of Iraqi claims, the Greeks accepted no Iraqi claims whatsoever. Their acceptance rate is around 0. Germany at the same time was accepting 85% of Iraqi claims. So, their internal policies have still riven with tremendous inconsistency. Secondly, interdiction. Most of you know this. These are the various strategies by way of which they keep people out of the country. I'm going to talk about a few. The first one, territorial excision. The reason I mention it is because the famous progenitor of excision was Australia. This is where they said certain parts of Australia, such as Christmas Islands, are not Australia for the purposes of the Refugee Convention. That policy has been changed with the new government, so it's fallen into disrepute. However, what we have instead in terms of Europe, because a lot of the flows are now coming across the Mediterranean, we'll get to that slide in a minute, we have a combination of overseas interdiction. Basically, that's a boat pulling up, stopping someone, and sending them back, or even when they've arrived on particularly Italy and Spain and the Canary Islands, they still return them. And in particular, regional protection. The last one, Italy has managed to, a couple of years ago, has managed to come to a bilateral agreement with Libya, who is not a signatory to the convention. And the agreement is that we will simply return you to Libya, and Libya will do the refugee determination there, or in many cases instantly detain them, and in many instances having returned them. The other notion along with the physical interdiction is the deaths. And in that regard, there we've got our little arrows, and there's various ways to look at this. The International Center for Migration Policy Development says there are 2,000 a year dying. We've seen other numbers that makes it 4 and 5 times that rate. The truth of the matter is it's hard to know, because if you're from a tiny African village, you drowned in the middle of the Mediterranean, or you drowned going across the Gulf of Aden. The fact of the matter is that's not going to get recorded in a statistic very many times. But certainly, in terms of the number of deaths, if you look at that chart, you can see the kinds of numbers of deaths that are being reported in some places there. It is a sign of the desperation of migrants. So I now want to leave the world of refugees and talk about forced migration. In regard to forced migration, I want to take you to a little village in Senegal by the name of Chairperson. I know you all know it. Probably several of you have vacationed there several times. Here's what I'd like to tell you about the village of Chairperson. You can all figure out that it's right on the coast, and it is a little fishing village. I told you the theme of fishing will come back a few times. It is a population of a few thousand. The number of young men who have departed for Europe are several hundred. How they manage to get to Europe is they get in these long, narrow fish boats called pirogue, which can be as long as 6 meters long. Sometimes they're as loaded with as many as 120 people. Everybody's traveling deck. Nobody's on the upper portions of these little canoes. And it is a 6-day journey up along the west coast of Africa, usually heading for either mainland Spain or the Canary Islands. It is a very dangerous trip. In this little village in the year 2006, they lost 209 young men. The reasons for departure: there are no more fish. Not contained in the article, so I don't really know this, I confess this, but I believe it to be true that most of the fishermen destroyed by, guess who? The Spanish, the Portuguese, and the Russians, who have been drastically overfishing along that fire. I know that they destroyed the fishery in Namibia. I have no reason for not thinking that they destroyed the fisheries in between Europe and Namibia as well. But there are other reasons, and this is what's interesting for the complexity of migration. There are other reasons why the young men from that village would be going to Europe. One of them is that actually it's not the poorest part of Europe, the country at all. And some people in the village have televisions, and they can look at Europe. They can look at the lifestyle. If they're looking at a French program, they can actually understand what they're doing. Secondly, although it may seem like dangerous access, they do have access to Europe. In 2006, 16,000 Senegalese migration to Europe, approximately 6,000 died. How do they know they died? Because within 2 weeks they'll phone once they get there, and if they haven't heard from them in 6 months, then the village will assume that they've died. The Spanish Navy patrols now go all along the west coast, not just the Mediterranean, to intercept anybody that they think might be heading to Europe. Another interesting note from the point of view of migration, although there are these 16,000 Senegalese alone, and that's the largest of the West African flows, but they're coming from all of the West African countries. 75% of African migration, however, is inter-African. It is not to Europe itself. In terms of migration, I just want to say a few things. First of all, in terms of globalization, so I'm talking about regular and irregular migration now. I mean, since this is a room of migration scholars, I'm slowly getting out there to the broader issues. In terms of globalization, it's the massive, massive increase in the last 10 years of transnational migration. It's the physical capacity to move. It's the communications technology that people know far more about other parts of the world, which engenders aspiration to go. And in addition, and this accounts primarily, I would say, for regular migration, there are now 200 million, more than 200 million people who are living in countries other than where they were born. The migratory patterns themselves are complex. First of all, their legal status, it can be regular, irregular, it can morph and change during the course of their journey itself. The routes taken, not just because of smugglers, because of the different forms of access, have become tremendously complex. One interesting phenomenon used to be you talked about a country of origin, you talked about transit countries, you talked about countries of destination. Now, a country such as India or South Africa or Turkey can be all three at the same time. And we're seeing more of that kind of notion. There's both permanent and temporary residence. There's far more of that than before. There's multiple nationality. More and more people are citizens of more than one country. And there is forced and voluntary migration. And why I've got that at the end is because even that changes, that it isn't necessarily constant. So the old notion in terms of refugee definition, where I'm living in a country, horrible things happen to me because I said horrible things to the president, and I flee, coming through a transit country, getting to my host country of destination, seek protection under the UN Convention. Those models, to a large degree, are old and out of date. So in regard to motivations for migration, first of all, political. Well, that's the model I already talked about, where the refugee either fears the state or has a failure of protection of the state, armed conflicts inform convention-type reasons, flees the country. But it's far more complex than that now. If you look at environmental factors, places like Darfur and Somalia, many people will tell you, in actuality, it's the scarce water resources far more than the ethnic or the political issues that are driving the movement.